Let's talk about critical lessons for GMs adapted from one of the best writers of all time. Hey there, Seeker of Ultimate Truth, this is GM Jim here to dole out the good stuff. Elmore Leonard is arguably one of the best authors of crime books from the 20th century. Even if you haven't read any, you've likely seen some of the movies adapted from his stuff, like Tarantino's Jackie Brown, or the Travolta movie Get Shorty, or George Clooney and Jennifer Lopez in Out of Sight. Also westerns like 3:10 to Yuma and the TV show Justified. Everything I know about writing dialogue in my books, I learned from Mr. Elmore Leonard. But we're not diving into fiction writing education, this is an advice video for game masters. And since Leonard published a list of 10 rules for writers from which I think we can draw some excellent TTRPG lessons, that's what we're talking about. And it's 10 rules, but I've combined a few of them, and there's a bonus rule, so instead of 11, it's actually 8. Got it? Good. Here we go. Rule number 1 is, never open a book with weather. It was a dark and stormy night. We're running campaigns, not writing books, but there's a lot of wisdom in this advice about avoiding cliches. Personally, I don't see anything wrong with having a group meet in a tavern for the first time. I can already feel you rushing toward the comments to accuse me of being basic, and you're probably right. But meeting in a tavern is great for new TTRPG players because it gives the GM a chance to introduce them one by one, and also gives them a chance to roleplay something simple. What would your character like to drink? But I think the advice we take from Elmore Leonard here is that since opening a book with weather is a done-to-death trope, that it's fine to branch out from the standard tavern opening. I often like to have the PCs just know each other already, especially if I'm running a one-shot or if I need to hurry up the pacing for some other reason. Consider the genre and the tropes you want to reinforce in your campaign, and your opening should reflect that. Starting with no memories and no gear in a dank prison cell is very different from starting at some town's annual pumpkin festival. Which one do you want to communicate to your players as hints of things to come? Our second rule is avoid prologues, and this needs a little bit of context. Surveys have found that readers of fiction books quite often skip prologues and go straight to chapter 1. And this is because too many writers include prologues for, quote, flavor. These prologues often feature unrelated characters, it takes place in a different era, and has nothing to do with the book's actual plot. Fantasy and sci-fi writers are very guilty of this. I'm looking at you, George R.R. Martin. I think we can apply this to TTRPGs as the simple fact that some players don't tune in unless their characters are directly involved. So don't start your session with 15 minutes of side narration just to, quote, set the tone and mood. Half your players aren't even listening. I'm all in favor of starting a session with a 2-minute lore drop that takes place inside the Queen's Court or deep within the Goblin Cave. But keep those bits of flavor brief and remember that the story is there to serve the characters, not the other way around. Now we're going to combine a couple of rules, so the next two are: Number 3, never use a verb other than said to carry dialogue. And number 4, never use an adverb to modify the verb said, he admonished gravely. I love Leonard's use of snark here. We're combining these because they're basically two versions of the same rule. I think the lesson he's trying to impart here is to let the weight of the story carry itself. You don't need to dress it up in fancy clothes or hit your players over the head with it. It's always better if you can give the players clues and let them figure out the twists for themselves. Of course, we also have to be aware of the fact that oftentimes players don't have as much insight into the story as you think they would or think they should. They often miss stuff. But before you simply tell them that the prince is evil and is going to betray them, give them the clues and see if they can figure it out for themselves. It's much more rewarding that way. We're also going to combine the next two rules. Number 5 is keep your exclamation points under control. You are allowed no more than 2 or 3 per 100,000 words of prose. And number 6 is never use the words suddenly or all hell broke loose. And what our esteemed author is saying here is that your players get to decide for themselves what they find interesting in the campaign. They get to pick which path to follow. You might think your royal intrigue story about the princess and her queen regent mother is brilliant. Maybe you've got sessions worth of devious and awesome courtly politics planned. But then the PCs might choose to ignore all that and become laser focused on some throwaway detect thoughts detail about the tavern piano player not trusting her husband. Why is she so angry? What did the husband do? Is she going to take action against him? Now it's your job to stow the political story and instead think up some beats about what could be behind this marital strife that's piqued your party's interest. These diversions are going to happen. Anything you say to your players out loud becomes fair game when it comes to what they're going to want to follow. Rule number 7 is use regional dialect patois sparingly. One of my favorite novels is Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. You may remember the disappointingly mediocre movie adaptation by the Wachowskis that came out in the early 2000s. But the book is outstanding because halfway through I realized it's actually a meta-commentary on literary genres. Brilliant. Anyway, I'll come to my point very soon, I promise. The book is 6 different stories in 6 completely different genres, and one of those stories takes place in a quasi-low-tech / high-tech far future, kinda like Horizon Zero Dawn. And in this story, the characters speak in this incredibly dense slang all the time. It's hard to read and understand even basic conversations in this story. At first this was frustrating, but that's actually the point. And I told you all that to tell you, don't do this in your game. Don't burden your players with too many slang words and in-world terms. It's fine to use Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday as days of the week and spring, fall, summer, and winter as your seasons. Because when you start asking players to remember that the story takes place on the first blurgak of the Reg Durnabel season, at the 11th hour of Merfarkle, your players will be very lost. This stuff is easier for you to remember because you wrote it and you've been rehearsing it. Your players are not so lucky. Ease them into your world building, gently, with just the tip at first. I'm sorry, that was inappropriate. Let's move on. We're going to combine 2 more rules, and that's avoid detailed descriptions of characters, and don't go into great detail describing places and things. Of all Mr. Leonard's rules, these 2 are the most obvious and have the most direct correlation to tabletop games. He believed that characters should reveal themselves through their dialogue and actions and sometimes didn't give physical descriptions of his characters at all, much like Hemingway did. I don't think you should be so totally bare bones in D&D. NPCs need to have at least a small amount of physical description, but you can get by with a lot less than you think. If I say, the shopkeeper pushes her spectacles up her nose and says, "Oh yes, Diddies, what can I get for you?" You probably already had a solid idea of what that character looks like, right? And there's a lot of merit to giving your players enough detail about their surroundings, especially in combat, and extra especially in theater of the mind combat. But when you drone on for far too long about what the wall sconces look like, your pacing will suffer. And that leads me into the next rule. Number 10 is, try to leave out the part that readers tend to skip, which is a fancy way of saying, don't be boring. And the definition of what is and isn't boring will vary from group to group and game to game. The average player of Call of Cthulhu or Thirsty Sword Lesbians might value a different flavor of storytelling than the lover of crunchy 4th edition D&D. Your players might adore lush descriptions of overland travel, or they may want to skip travel completely and go straight from town to outside the dungeon. So to find out what parts your players, quote, tend to skip, just ask them. Talk to your group, have a solid session 0 and find out what kind of stuff they're interested in, and then point your story focus toward that. And don't be scared to check in regularly to ask them how things are going. What do they want more of? What do they want less of? Great game masters not only run the game well, they adjust the game as needed to the current crop of players at the table. A quick aside, if you like this video, check out the one I made about Kurt Vonnegut's rules for storytelling in D&D 2. I think you'll dig it. And now that bonus rule that brings our total up to 11, or actually 8, is probably my favorite piece of writing advice I've ever heard. And that is, if it sounds like writing, I rewrite it. This is the kind of advice that you're going to want to marinate on for a little while. Go ahead, I'll put it back up on the screen so you can pause the video and think about this simple sentence. So what is Elmore Leonard saying here? I think when it comes to fiction, he's saying that the words themselves on the page should fade into the background as the reader becomes immersed in the story. But how does this figure into tabletop games? I could be really lofty here and say that your goal is to make players forget they're even playing a game, to become so immersed that it feels real. But that's just not humanly possible for any extended stretch of time. When someone's phone dings, or the pizza delivery person knocks, or the kids start fighting in the other room, the immersion is going to break. And that's fine. We are distractible humans and this is a game. But your entire job, Game Master, is to just try to get your players to ignore the ding of their phone. That's basically it, to make them want to stay immersed in your world for as long as you can. Be exciting, subvert expectations, do things they won't expect. Make promises and then deliver on them in fun and exciting ways. And above all, if things are getting boring, pivot. So that's 11 writing rules by Elmore Leonard, adapted by me for Game Masters. I'm GM Jim, and I hope you've drawn some inspiration from this. Now go out there and try to run games that your players will think about between sessions.